During the earliest days of the Great Crusade, just 10 or so years after leaving the boundaries of the Sol system, the Emperor of Mankind would bring the feral world of Chthoniya into the fold of his nascent Imperium of Man. It was upon this world that the Emperor would be reunited with his lost son, Horus Lupercal, a demigod born of genetic engineering whose DNA served as the template for the warriors of the 16th Legion of the Legione Astartes, the Lunar Wolves. In time, after receiving years of tutelage and training from the Emperor himself, Horus would finally be granted formal command over his legion, and would go on to lead the Lunar Wolves to victory innumerable times over the course of the Crusade. However, at some indeterminate point in time after Horus's reunion with the Emperor, but prior to him taking command of his legion, the Lunar Wolves, alongside the warriors of the Imperial Fists, would be tasked by the Emperor with bringing the world of Luhman into compliance. It was upon this world that Imperial forces would encounter a warped and aberrant offshoot of humanity, one which, according to official records, had subjected themselves to extreme levels of genetic engineering and DNA manipulation in order to survive the Age of Strife. Indeed, the people of Luhman had become so twisted in appearance that they were considered to be no longer fully human, sporting toughened pitch-black hides that were resistant to both blades and bullets, large eyes that could see in near total darkness, and powerful claws that could rip their way through ceramite with terrifying ease. The people of Luhman would prove to be savage and tenacious foes, so much so that the records detailing the casualties they inflicted upon Imperial forces vastly outnumber those regarding both the world itself and the battle to bring it into compliance. During the final hours of the conflict, the Lunar Wolves' praetor, Morale Lupus, a fearsome warrior known amongst his brothers as the White Wolf, would succeed in slaying a hulking creature, which was said to have been the very primogenitor of the twisted Luminite horrors, though he would himself be mortally wounded in return. Before dying, however, the White Wolf would bequeath his blade to a young warrior named Imranadaris, a lieutenant of the Imperial Fists who had aided the White Wolf in his battle against the primogenitor beast. In return, Adaris swore an oath to forever defend the honor of the 7th and 16th Legions with both his sword and his life. While no visual records depicting the people of Luhman would survive the events of the Great Crusade, with the only knowledge of their appearance coming from second-hand accounts, the few details that are known are disturbingly similar to those of an alien threat that the Imperium would encounter many thousands of years later. This then leads to an intriguing question. Could it be possible that the people of Luhman, instead of being the byproducts of genetic engineering, were instead members of all things, a Genestealer cult? Initially, such an idea would appear to be incredibly unlikely, due to the fact that the Imperium would not officially encounter Genestealers until sometime around M35, roughly 5,000 years after the Battle of Luhman. However, while Genestealers wouldn't be officially encountered by the Imperium until M35, this doesn't rule out the possibility that such creatures could have come into contact with humanity prior to this. Indeed, this idea could even potentially apply to the Tyrannid race as a whole. While first contact with the Tyrannids would officially be made in late M41 with the arrival of High Fleet Behemoth, there are rumors suggesting that at least one other High Fleet tendril could have come into conflict with the Imperium as early as M36. This particular High Fleet, retroactively designated by scholars as High Fleet Ouroboros, would be first documented as appearing within the vicinity of the warp space rift known as the Eye of Terror, leading many to believe that Ouroboros had arrived ahead of the other High Fleets due to it being caught in a freak warp storm that resulted in them being hurled forwards through time. Indeed, it's even possible that the horrors upon Luhman, if they were indeed a type of Genestealer, could have originated from the spawning pools of Ouroboros, as the Luminites, as mentioned earlier, were described as having armoured hides that were black in coloration. While the bioforms of High Fleet Ouroboros boast flesh that is a dark blue, their chitinous armor plating is indeed an oily black in color. In addition, the Luhmanite horrors were stated to have claws that could rend ceramite, a key material utilized in the construction of Space Marine power armor. The claws of Genestealers, in addition to that of their first, second, and sometimes even third generation offspring, are noted and rightly feared for their armor-piercing capabilities, granting such creatures the ability to tear through Terminator armor that is designed to withstand the impact of heavy weapons such as missile launchers and las cannons, as if it were little more than tissue paper. Not only this, but the primogenitor of the Luhmanite horrors, as detailed within the Siege of Chthoniya campaign book, was stated outright to be enormous. This in itself could be a vague description of an organism known as a Genestealer patriarch. After all, the patriarch, as the organism that sired its brood in the first place, will inevitably be the largest and most powerful entity within a Genestealer cult, having become swollen with muscle and bloated with raw, undiluted psychic power. As well as this, the fact that the people of Le Mans were stated to be no longer fully human could in itself be evidence to the presence of Genestealer hybrids. Whenever a Genestealer infiltrates a society, they will infect several members of the local population with their genetic material via an ovipositor, who are not only brought under the psychic thrall of the patriarch, but are instilled with the overwhelming desire to mate and reproduce. The resulting offspring sired by an infected individual will exhibit traits from both the Genestealer and their host species, appearing as a monstrous amalgamation of the two that grows to maturity in just a matter of weeks or months. These hybrids will then flock together and interbreed, resulting in more hybrid offspring, with each successive generation becoming visibly more and more like the host species, with 4th generation hybrids being nigh indistinguishable in appearance, save for being bald and boasting a heavier bone structure. With this in mind, it's entirely reasonable to assume that the mutant creatures encountered by the Lunar Wolves and Imperial Fists could have been 1st and 2nd generation hybrids, as such creatures would bear only the most superficial of human characteristics when compared to later generations. While the idea of the Legione Astartes encountering a Genestealer cult is indeed an interesting one, there are a number of issues with this particular hypothesis. Firstly, the Luhmanite horrors, despite appearing to have at least some superficial similarities to Genestealer hybrids, were never explicitly stated to have additional limbs. The reason why this is important is due to the fact that 1st and 2nd generation hybrids are shown to always have at least 3 arms, while 3rd generation hybrids can sport between 2 to 3 arms, with 4th generation hybrids rarely, if ever, sporting more than 2. That being said, however, it could be argued that since the Luhmanites were described as no longer resembling anything fully human, at least some of their number may have sported an abnormal number of limbs, although there is no way of knowing for certain. Secondly, it should be noted that there have been multiple documented instances of Imperial forces encountering worlds whose populations have been subjected to genetic manipulation, willingly or otherwise, during the course of the Great Crusade. A particularly extreme example of this is shown within the short story Misbegotten, in where the Lunar Wolves' 63rd Expeditionary Fleet would encounter a veritable army of biomechanical monstrosities upon the isolated world of Veliktan. These monstrosities, which had been engineered by the renegade Terran geneticist Basilio Foe, varied wildly in both size and appearance, with such abominations including starfish-like creatures formed from human limbs, serpentine beasts made from intestinal tracts, and even mechanically augmented creatures the size of an Imperial dropship. While in appearance they appeared to be anything but, such creatures were, at a genetic level, still human. Unwilling to have his world brought under Imperial yoke, Basilio Foe unleashed his monstrous creations upon the Lunar Wolves, which fought with such bestial ferocity that they almost succeeded in killing Horus Lupercal himself. Despite this, however, the Lunar Wolves would ultimately prove victorious, and the geneticist would be captured and shipped back to Terra in chains, where he would be incarcerated within the dungeons beneath the Imperial Palace. As such, it's entirely reasonable to assume that the once human populace of Luhman could have themselves been engineered in a similar manner, rather than being evidence of an unofficial first contact between the Imperium and Genestealers. Ultimately, however, while it is certainly not impossible for the Imperium to have come into conflict with a Genestealer cult at the dawn of the Great Crusade, the lack of surviving records regarding the Battle of Luhman means that such a notion remains fairly unlikely and improbable at best. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching!